Hi everyone, welcome to BRICS Briefs. Sorry about the late start. We have a special guest, returning guest, Adjunct Professor Warwick Powell. So let's bring him on. We've delayed a little bit, so let's get going. Hi Warwick, thanks for coming.
Hey Clive, good to be with you.
Excellent. President Trump has declared that BRICS is dead, asserting that his threat of 100% tariffs on BRICS nations has effectively ended the bloc's ambition to challenge the US dollar's dominance. However, your analysis suggests that such a move might inadvertently accelerate the shift away from the US dollar. You've noted that the US makes up a declining share of global trade. So my first question, Warwick, is, given this context, how do you assess the likely impact of Trump's tariff threats on the BRICS nations' resolve to de-dollarize? And could these threats potentially backfire by actually hastening the move towards currency multipolarity?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think the first thing to do to think about this set of problems is to reflect upon what it is that's happening in relation to the BRICS nations that is driving the transformations in the contours of trade that they are involved in, and ultimately also as a result of that, impacting the way that they think about the currencies that are used to facilitate payments. What's happening, and this has been happening now for the best part of the last decade and a half to 2 decades, is that countries have been growing their trading relationships with each other and in relative terms, diminishing the trading relationships that they have with the United States. So 30 years ago, the United States was the single largest trading partner of the vast majority of countries in the world. That's no longer the case. That's not to say that the US isn't a substantial economy, but nonetheless, it's no longer the central figure within the trading ecosystem. Now, because of that, the rationale for using US dollars as the means of payment for trade amongst non-American countries begins to diminish. There are additional costs related to holding foreign exchange reserves as well as managing foreign exchange risks. And there are also transaction costs that involve fees and charges that have to be paid to messaging organizations such as SWIFT. So for those sorts of reasons, countries and enterprises have been exploring ways over the last decade or so to reduce the need for using US dollars in trading settlements when the trading parties aren't, neither of them are from the United States. So that's your fundamental reasons why the global system is actually changing. It's changing because trading relationships have been changing. And because trading relationships are changing, enterprises and countries are looking for lower cost, quicker and cheaper ways of doing things. Now, to enable that to happen, over the course of the last 10 years, a number of institutions have been progressively developed, including swap agreements between the central banks of various countries that will enable the settlements of trade to take place in non-US dollar terms. These swap arrangements enable banks to be confident that there is sufficient liquidity to settle the accounts when they become due. The other institutions that have been created are mechanisms by which the participant countries' central banks are able to track and notify each other of payments that need to be made. So these are essentially messaging platforms and alternatives to the SWIFT network. So the Russians and the Chinese and the Indians have all developed these sorts of communications networks that enable banks to communicate with each other and to securely pass messages to and from each other so that they can make adjustments to accounts and ultimately finalize updates on the respective ledgers. So over the last 10 years or more, there have been a lot of things happening already that has progressively led to the expansion of the use of non-US dollars for the settlement of trade. And that ultimately, I guess, crescendoed if you will, in the enforced movement of the US dollar system for Russia as a result of sanctions that were imposed initially after the annexation of Crimea, which took place after the Maidan coup in 2014, and more recently after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So these are well-established patterns and trends. The reaction from the United States to all of this, to threaten tariffs on all and sundry if they dared use something other than the US dollars to facilitate trade, actually reinforces the concerns that countries have, and that is that the US dollar, which is issued by the US government or by American banks, ultimately can be used against them. And that gives good reason for other countries to mitigate those risks by using currencies other than the United States dollar. Threats to impose tariffs, in other words, the weaponized trade policy, together with the weaponization of payment systems and US dollar assets over the last 10 years or so, really create an environment where countries will increasingly look to alternatives. And that's one of the reasons why the threats to impose tariffs runs the risk of seriously backfiring on Trump and accelerating the processes of currency multipolarity.
And I'll just make it clear to the audience, Warwick has published an article. It was just today, wasn't it, Warwick, or yesterday?
Today, actually. I wrapped it up late last night, but it's published on my Substack, which is it's ended up being part 2 of what I think will be a 3-part series on questions related to tariffs, BRICS, de-dollarization, currency multipolarity, and cross-border payment systems. So the one that I published today is actually part 2. Part 1 was published probably about 10 days ago, but people can find it on the Substack, Warwick Powell at Substack. Yeah.
Oh, there you go. Yes. Yeah. So, we're going to be referring to the topics within that. So if you want to read that, if you want to pause and etc., or you can't pause because we're live, but if you want to go there, and then you'll understand more. The next question, I just want to confirm here and make it clear, because you talked a lot in this article about the American capital markets. If you could please define for us briefly what you mean by capital markets.
Yeah, well, I'll contextualize that. So when the US runs its trade deficit, which it does with the world generally, the mainstream argument is that deficit is financed by America's capital markets, and that it is because of the depth and breadth of US capital markets that finances the trade deficit. The capital markets, in essence, are the markets for financial assets and finance-related derivative assets, such as stocks and bonds, derivatives, options, foreign exchange, etc. So these are what I would generally describe as fictitious capital instruments, which are essentially assets that give the holders a right to make a claim on future value. So they don't confer upon the holder a right to what I would call a use value. They're not assets that can be used in the production system to create services or goods that are either used in future production processes or are consumed, but they are nothing more than the rights to make claims on future monetized value streams. So bonds, for example, confer upon the holders a right to interest payments and ultimately the redemption of capital on maturity. If you hold stocks, it confers upon the holder the right to dividend payments, subject to company policy and regulatory arrangements. If you hold options, it confers upon the holder the right to exercise an option to do something else, such as complete a purchase of something or another. And all of these instruments are tradable. So between the time these instruments come into existence and the time where they mature, they can change hands many, many times. And in fact, the processes by which these instruments change hands through capital markets creates transaction value, the volume of the total transaction values, to a point where they dwarf the total value of the trade in goods and services annually. So capital markets are markets for fictitious capital instruments. Now, the reason why they in a sense exist in the context of the US trade deficit is that the US trade deficit is actually not financed by the capital markets, contrary to what some in the mainstream would argue, but that in fact capital markets grow as a consequence of how the trade deficit is financed. So the mainstream argument essentially gets the whole sequence of events back to front, and they confuse cause and consequence. The US trade deficit is financed by the ability of the United States to issue US dollars. It issues US dollars through two principal mechanisms. One is through government expenditure, and it can do that because the Constitution provides the lawful means by which Congress can pass appropriations bills. And when they do that, the Treasury account at the Fed is credited with money, and then from there on, the money goes into circulation. The other mechanism by which money goes into circulation in the US economy is through commercial banks issuing credit. And not all organizations can do that. So only chartered institutions, through the provisions of legislation, have the authority to take deposits, of course, but to also issue loans. And the act of issuing loans or giving credit, in effect, adds money to the economic system. So the United States is able to finance its trade deficit through the way that it mints or issues US dollars. Once those US dollars are issued, companies use those US dollars to settle accounts when they buy things from exporters from other countries. The reason why those exporters are willing to take the US dollar in exchange for the goods or services is because they are either able to use those US dollars to buy goods and services sold by American firms, number one. But if they've got surpluses, surplus US dollars, they're able to hold those US dollars either as cash, which enables them to make purchases in the future, or they exchange cash for some form of interest-bearing security, such as a US government bond, or they acquire other forms of fictitious capital, such as stocks, derivatives, etc., as I described earlier. And the reason they do that is because those capital instruments, fictitious capital instruments, earn money, whereas holding cash tends not to earn very much at all by way of interest. That's why the American capital markets exist. And you can start to see how, as the US continues to inject money into the economy, as the economy grows, and for a whole range of other reasons associated with supply chain disruptions, inflation, causing greater demand on cash flow finance, etc., the capital markets also grows, and eventually the capital markets grow to such a point that they seriously dwarf what's going on in the real economy, and that's actually why capital markets have historically ballooned in the United States, and why they are fundamentally tied to what happens in the real economy, but at the same time end up floating free of the real economy on a day-to-day basis, because you can trade these instruments without worry as to what's going on in the real world. At some point in time, of course, they reconnect with the real world, because that's where you, in a sense, valorize the potential value of these instruments, either by exercising an option, or when a bond matures, or when you gain some sort of monetary payment from owning stocks in companies, and those monies have to be earned by these companies through whatever economic activities they're engaged in. So that's when the real economy of use value production ultimately delivers the monetized flows that are necessary to support the revenue or the value claims that are made in the fictitious capital market. I hope that was clear enough.
No, that's good. No, it's good. So we've prepared some questions. So I do apologize to the audience. I'm going to be reading these, and it's a fairly detailed subject. So, you explained a little bit on the weaponization of the US dollar through sanctions and other financial tools. And that's increased the risk of holding US dollars and US denominated assets. You've also mentioned that BRICS nations are actively seeking alternatives, including the BRICS Clear project. So, given the risk associated with holding US dollars and the efforts by BRICS to create alternative payment systems, can you discuss the key features of the BRICS Clear project and what challenges must be addressed to make such a system viable and widely adopted? How can capital controls play a role in this transition?
So, first thing to understand is how the US dollar has been progressively weaponized and what makes that possible. And often when people think about money, they think about money as having a commodity form, right? But that's actually not what happens anymore. It's been a very, very long time since money actually exists in some commodity form as the predominant form in which money exists. By and large, money exists as notations in balance sheets, which are recorded on ledgers. And the ledger for US dollars is actually operated by commercial banks and ultimately by the Fed. So even foreign holders of US dollars actually hold those dollars, so to speak, in accounts with the Fed. So if you're the Chinese central bank and you hold US dollar reserves, those US dollar reserves are actually recorded on ledgers that are controlled by the Fed. As a result of that, the Fed is in a position to make it impossible for the account holder to access the accounts or to block actions that the account holder wants to do in relation to the funds that are recorded in their account. So that's one way in which the monetary assets are exposed to risk of being weaponized. So we've seen that also in the Russian case, where Russian US dollars have been frozen and they can't access them. The other ways in which the system has been weaponized is to block bank access to the messaging network that connects most banks. So when transactions are taking place, what actually happens is that the central bank of the buying country sends a message to the central bank of the selling country to notify them of a need to make adjustments to the accounts. So in one case, it'll be deducting funds from the account, and in the other case, it'll be adding funds to another account. And those account adjustments are reflected also in the accounts that the commercial banks hold with their respective central banks. And the reason that matters is that ultimately the trade that takes place is between enterprises who have accounts with commercial banks. So it is a little cascading networks of accounts that are being maintained on ledgers that are operated by particular institutions. Because of that, when in the system as it tends to operate today, when adjustments are being made to ledgers, that takes place when one bank communicates with another bank. If you stop people from accessing the communications network, you in effect stop their ability to transact, because unless you can communicate with your counterparties, then there's no way that there will be adjustments made to the accounts that you operate in their institutions anyway. So these are some of the ways in which weaponization takes place. Now, if you can block the flow of messages, or you can actually block access to funds that are held in accounts, then you in effect stop the ability of these organizations, the companies in the different countries, from going about doing business with others. Now, trade is an important part of many economies to varying extents. And in particular for the developing world, trade has been a very important part of their pathway to economic development, because they typically trade raw materials for new technologies. And that process of trade enables, theoretically speaking anyway, developing countries to develop the complexity of their economies, whereby they can then expand industry and become more energy self-sufficient and industrially self-sufficient as well. So these are the patterns of economic development in which trade plays an important role. Now, when countries who are engaged in a growing amount of trade with each other are using the currency of some third party, the risk is that that third party decides to intervene and stop your ability to trade with someone else. Because of that, BRICS over the course of the last so many years has been working firstly on bilateral national currency-based settlements, so that trade, for example, between Russia and India are now settled in either rubles or the Indian national currency, or even the UAE national currency has been used as well. And the same applies for trade settlements between Russia and China, and Russia and the Southeast Asian nations in ASEAN. So increasingly, the settlement of trades amongst BRICS countries is being done with currencies other than the US dollar. In the Russian case, as I was touching upon earlier, over 90% of Russia's trade with China now is settled in either rubles or RMB. Over 70% of its trade with ASEAN countries is settled in national currencies as well. So there is a clear move, and where necessary, as is the case with Russia, to make a more or less a complete move away from the USD-dominated system, then quite clearly it is possible. Now, the next step that's taking place, and your question went to this, is the discussions that emerged a couple of years ago at the BRICS Leaders Summit that put the idea of a BRICS payment system on the table. And ever since then, there has been progressive discussions, and now I think design and development work to turn the general idea of having a BRICS payment system into reality. Such a system is likely to be digitalized, of course, and it's likely to have design features that are very different from the dominant existing system. So as I described earlier, the dominant existing system enables a single party to capriciously meddle with accounts and stymie the ability of account holders from doing business with others through transactions on their accounts. Therefore, the BRICS system, which is being described as called BRICS Clear, which came out of the Kazan summit last October. So BRICS Clear is likely to be anchored by a distributed ledger. And a distributed ledger, in effect, is a ledger that is maintained and updated on a network of computers that are operated, in this case, by the central banks of the participating BRICS countries. So that's the first design feature of a BRICS Clear system. I think the second design feature is that its focus is on enabling the use of this system to support national currency-based transactions. Now, this has already been happening, as I mentioned, where Russia is buying things from China in either ruble or RMB and vice versa. But the system aims to streamline that and create a consolidated, standardized approach that will make it cheaper, quicker, more reliable, and easier for BRICS nations and new BRICS nations, as the BRICS organization grows, to take advantage of these payment systems. The third feature, which I think is going to come over time, is the development of what is in effect a central bank's means of payment and a unit of account. This is not a currency per se in the sense that we would understand a currency to be, but it's the way in which the central banks that participate in this system actually maintain a track record of the flows of transactions amongst enterprises in their respective countries. And the central bank unit of account is in effect a non-national central bank currency, but with a very limited range of use cases, namely that they are used as settlements between the central banks themselves. These aren't currencies that are used by commercial banks, and they're certainly not currencies that are used at a retail level by businesses directly transacting with each other or by individuals who might be traveling, for example, as business visitors or tourists. So I would expect there to be considerable discussion around the ways in which the participating central banks will ultimately create and support a BRICS unit of account, and through that process govern the exchange rate that will be operative between the different participating countries. The mBridge project, which I think we've discussed before on a previous program, I think provides some insights into what a BRICS Clear system could look like. So mBridge supports national currency settlements. It doesn't have a floating exchange rate system of price discovery. The exchange rates are agreed between the transacting parties through negotiation, and I would expect that, in fact, that kind of system will more than likely be the system that will emerge and mature over time with BRICS. The issue of capital controls, I think, becomes an interesting one because as you make these transitions, one of the challenges is to make sure that there is sufficient liquidity of different currencies in each market to ultimately enable the settlement of accounts, and therefore managing capital flows becomes quite important in that, because you don't want to see all the capital leave one country and end up in another country, causing a capital deficit in the first country. So managing that's going to become quite important. The other thing too is that, contrary to the US dollar-based system, which relies upon the ability for US dollar holders to purchase American fictitious capital assets, the BRICS system, based on national currency settlements, has no need to really enable holders of surpluses of other countries' currencies to be able to acquire large volumes of fictitious capital assets. And in part, that will be mediated by this non-national currency in any case. So capital markets between different countries and the flows and circulations of money capital into other forms, such as through the acquisition of bonds or stocks and other derivative instruments, will actually work quite differently. I suspect that there will be far less free-flowing movement of money capital and a far greater emphasis on a range of prescribed channels, institutions, and also product types where a country that holds a surplus of another country's currency can commit those funds in a very particular range of things. And we've seen that, for instance, recently with the development of the regulatory harmonisation between the Saudi Arabian financial regulatory world and the Chinese regulatory world, which enables the creation of traded instruments on Chinese stock exchanges, which have their counterparties on the Saudi stock exchange. And it's those sorts of mechanisms that I think will become more prevalent over the next, into the future, as a new set of trading regimes and a new set of currency regimes begin to take hold.
Okay, no, that's great. So in your article, you indicated that a reduction in demand for US dollars could lead to a reevaluation of assets, particularly US de-denominated fictitious capital. And you also noted that a shift towards real assets like commodities could occur. How might a decrease in the demand for the US dollars affect the valuation of assets? And what sectors or countries stand to gain or lose from this potential revaluation? How might BRICS nations benefit from a shift to real assets?
Well, the demand for US dollars is largely a function of the factors that I described earlier. But if the need for US dollars in a cross-border trade settlements context diminishes, then there will just be less US dollars floating around in the international system. So moves that will diminish the amount of trade with the United States will actually impact the amount of US dollars that will float into the international system and de facto impact demand for US dollars. And once that happens and entities around the world actually just have less US dollars, they will have less interest in US dollar denominated fictitious capital markets. So this is I would think, is the unintended consequence, of course, of the threats of imposing 100% tariffs on BRICS countries, ostensibly in the name of punishing them for thinking about de-dollarizing. The irony or the paradox here is that that move alone will actually contribute to de-dollarization rather than bring it to a halt. As there is less global money, US dollars, being recycled into US fictitious capital, those markets will be affected because to some extent there will be lesser liquidity and lesser demand for the instruments that are traded on those markets. The effect of that is likely to be deflationary in terms of the asset value overall. So this is not about the effect of speculation per se, but simply a function of a reduced amount of US dollars floating around in the system, particularly from a globalized point of view, buying back in. Now, what will happen then, I guess, is there would prima facie be market-based adjustments to the value of these different fictitious capital assets. That's one thing. And it's likely that the natural direction of that adjustment would be downward, as I mentioned. So I think it would be reasonable to expect asset value impairments. Now, of course, authorities can respond to those risks through different measures, including increasing liquidity into the system to try to boost to compensate for the loss of the dollars coming back in. They could also look at becoming direct purchasers themselves, which central banks have done from time to time. So there will be measures that authorities, financial authorities, regulators, and government agencies will be giving thought to as to how it is that they could cushion the impairment risk to US fictitious capital assets. So, you know, they're the issues that I think are on the horizon. And as I mentioned, I think the paradox is that moves or threats of particular kinds of punitive actions in the name of protecting the value of the United States dollar and US dollar denominated assets could actually lead to the impairment of the value of those assets and the reduced utility of the United States dollar.
Mm. Well, you know, given President Trump's statements, you know, and they suggest that he sees BRICS as a threat to the US dollar, which, anyway, and it seeks to use tariffs to force the BRICS to maintain the dollar's role in global trade. You know, your analysis in this article, in this series of articles, implies that this approach is counterproductive and that BRICS move away from the dollar is a response to the weaponization of the US dollar and the evolution of international trade. You know, given this perspective, how should the US approach the shifting global financial landscape, and what specific strategies, other than threats of tariffs, would you recommend for the US to maintain its economic influence in the changing environment?
Well, before diving into what the US may or may not do, I think it's worth just bearing in mind that the role of the United States market in global trade has been diminishing over the last 70 years. So in the years immediately after World War II, the United States market provided somewhere in the region of about, well, United States trade, imports and exports, provide something like 25% of global trade. Today, it's about 15%. So the US market, from an import and export point of view, is simply nowhere near as important as it used to be. Now, of that 15%, about 8.5% is with the EU, Japan, Canada, Republic of Korea, and Australia. So the large collective Western allied economies, and about 7% or so is with the rest of the world. So from the point of view of the rest of the world, the US market is simply nowhere near as significant as it once was. And because of that, the threat of tariffs as a barrier, in effect, to market access is simply not as significant as it might have been 20, 30 years ago. So I don't think tariff threat is as big a stick as perhaps President Trump thinks it is. That's the first point to sort of take into account. The second point is that as trade grows amongst the rest of the world and actually grows at a greater rate than trade with the United States grows, that organic growth amongst complementary economies, and the BRICS economies are highly complementary, will actually enable BRICS countries to compensate for the loss of the US market within about 4 years. And in fact, with active fiscal support in the BRICS countries from government, in other words, providing fiscal stimulus into their respective economies, together with greater efforts to streamline bilateral and multilateral trade, you know, reducing regulatory barriers, the costs of paperwork and those sorts of things, ultimately also moving towards this streamlined payment system. It's feasible that the BRIC countries can adjust to the post-US dollar world even in even shorter time than the maximum of 4 years that I've estimated. And of course, in doing that, there is a lot of disruption. So anything that involves change and adjustment also involves disruption from business as usual. So there will be pain felt across the economic system of this country, and of course across the economic systems around the world, and also the United States itself. But adjustment does happen. And again, I reference the case of Russia post-sanctions, which demonstrates the ability of countries to make the kinds of adjustments they need to do when push comes to shove. So that's really the first point to bear in mind. And this is important because when President Trump talks about imposing 100% tariffs, in effect, that would mean the end of trade between BRICS and the United States, by and large. Probably put an end to 90% of the trade that currently takes place between BRICS countries in the United States. And once you've done that, and countries adjust and adapt, then in a sense they just move on. The move to impose tariffs ultimately, I think, will backfire because it will hasten the relative and then eventually the absolute reduction in trading relationships between BRICS countries and the United States. So that's the first thing it'll do. And in that, as we discussed earlier, it'll fundamentally transform the ways in which US dollars are circulated in the global system. So, you know, demand for US dollars internationally will diminish because they're just not used for trade. They're not used for trade because tariffs imposed by the United States has killed trade between the United States and these other countries. And when these countries don't have US dollars, they won't be in the business of buying American fictitious capital assets. So that's the sort of consequence. The US will, of course, have to adapt as well. And I guess this comes to the second part of your question, which is, well, what does the United States do? Its adaptation will see in the short term the inflationary pressures impact the economic system. And it's because it will experience supply chain disruptions in a very significant range of goods that currently are consumed by American businesses and American households. That inflationary dynamic will ultimately, I think, settle down, but at a higher price plateau. And it will settle down in part because new supply chains will be formed that are suboptimal because they weren't the ones that were optimized over 20, 30 years of trade and increased complexity of interactions between countries and supply chains and enterprises. But adjustments will take place. And the adjustments will take place for both end user commodities, you know, the goods that households use, as well as for capital goods and intermediate goods that companies will use as well. Companies will need to think seriously about whether or not they invest in fixed capital. That's certainly the hope of the tariffs move. So the idea of tariffs from President Trump's point of view is that they will reduce the amount of imported products coming into the market, and it will also induce some switching of demand from the imported goods to domestically supplied goods. And as domestically supplied goods experience shortages, that will induce investment in expanding output. That's the theory. I don't think the theory will work. The theory won't work because the United States production system is largely operating at a very high level of capacity utilization already. So there's not a lot more juice to be squeezed out of it in the event of there being shortages generally. So we're going to see inflationary pressures. The second thing that's hoped for is that somehow investment will take place in augmenting the fixed capital stock of the economic system so that it can expand its manufactured outputs. Now, fixed capital stock development is a risky and time-consuming activity. It's a complex activity, as evidenced, for example, by the problems that have been experienced by the heavily subsidized TSMC fab that's being constructed in Arizona, for example, and the fabs that are underway from the firms from Korea and from Samsung. And all of these have experienced problems in creating functional factories, in part because the cost of the equipment itself is very high. And if the US isn't buying low-cost capital goods from China, for example, it's going to buy high-cost capital goods from Japan and Korea and Germany. So it's going to be an expensive thing to do. The United States also needs to address a workforce quality issue. Modern manufacturing is not the same as manufacturing was 50, 60 years ago. Modern manufacturing demands a workforce that is highly literate and highly numerate. The United States labour force simply does not exhibit the numeracy and literacy performance levels that you would need to have for modern manufacturing ecosystems to be functional. The third constraint on this decapitalization of the American manufacturing industry is that capital costs will be high, because as inflation takes hold, the Fed will be tempted to increase interest rates. So cost of capital will rise. And when cost of capital rises, in an environment where entrepreneurs have options for deployment of capital, they will be looking at alternative uses other than, relatively expensive, long time requirement, high risk industrial investment. And of course, they will end up going back to the world of fictitious capital, property, insurance, and things like that. And when that happens, the ongoing financialization of the United States economy and the hollowing out of its industries that actually fundamentally underpin the concerns that have animated this move towards tariffs, all of those problems will actually become magnified. So the imposition of 100% tariffs triggers a whole range of consequences that are not necessarily in line with the ambitions of the tariff policies in the first place. So on the back of that kind of analysis, what does the US need to do? Well, let's assume that its ambitions to reindustrialize are, legitimate ambitions. To accomplish that, it will need to incur, actually, in the short term, greater deficits in capital goods and intermediate goods, because the US economy simply doesn't produce those. So that's the first thing it will need to do. It will need to actually expand its deficit in the name of bringing the deficit under control. The second thing it will need to do is address the issues of the labour force. So this is about building the human resources ecosystem that is necessary for new fixed capital investments to flourish. This is not something that you can do with a click of a finger. The problems in the education levels of the American workforce, generally speaking, in terms of literacy and numeracy, are a result of multiple decades worth of educational policy and delivery. So there is a need ultimately to address that. The third thing that's going to need to be addressed is addressing the issue of rewarding workers themselves. And that means incentivizing workers to come back to work in these new industries, modern and high-tech automated manufacturing supply chains, as opposed to working somewhere else. So that will, ultimately require some adjustments to how remunerations work. I think in part that will also demand some rethink of what you'd probably call the social wage and how that gets delivered. And by that I mean in particular healthcare in the United States. So long as healthcare is largely a private concern and isn't provided as a public good, then those costs ultimately are carried by the private sector, which impairs competitiveness of enterprises. And lastly, of course, and this is the big one, any move to try to expand manufacturing industry must take place in an environment where Wall Street is brought to heel. So until and unless the fictitious capital sectors are brought back down to earth and their roles diminished in the overall value of gross domestic product, then money capital will always be drawn to those sectors rather than to the industrial sectors that the policy ambitions seek to revitalise. So there are some big challenges for the United States. They're not insurmountable, but they aren't things that will be resolved with clicks of fingers, with sound bites, or with punitive actions on trading partners. In fact, trading partners are actually pretty important if the United States is to be able to fast track the rejuvenation of industry. And that's because trading partners could also be investment partners, bringing in their know-how and their technologies into the US industrial landscape so that these activities are taking place in the United States rather than in some other location.
Okay, look, Warwick, we've got about 8 minutes or so, 10 minutes left. What I wanted to do is have a short form dialogue with you to give the audience context of your views. So for example, I just want to show, there's examples from Australia which aren't directly relevant to BRICS per se, but in Australia we have a company, very large company that sells hardware, and you're aware of it. It's called Bunnings, right? And there's many of those products that come from nations such as China, and they're finished products. Now, I have several friends that have worked at Bunnings over the years, and they have told me in confidence, which I'm going to share to the public now with you, that Bunnings actually buys these finished products, imports them at a very, very small cost and marks them up sometimes thousands of %. Now, considering, and these are just some items, right? I'm not saying all of them, but in the context of Trump putting 100% tariff on BRICS countries. So in this example, isn't it possible that if Bunnings would just absorb, if they have to pay 10 cents for a rule, and they sell it for $3, then they can easily absorb that as if it has to be imported at 20 cents. Again, I know that's not for everything, but in considering this, on the ground, what would you say?
Well, tariffs are paid for by the importer. So the importer come distributor then needs to make some decisions, which is how much of that additional cost do they pass on to their customers. Typically, not all of those costs are passed on to the customers for reasons that you've just described. They will absorb some of that cost within their own margins. And they do that because they want to keep the customer. Okay? So that's basically the dynamic at play.
Yeah, and it really depends on the importer, right? What they decide, what that company decides.
Yeah, well, it depends on the product categories, and it also depends on how much competition there is in that market as well. So in the example that you mentioned, that sector is in large part more or less a monopoly. So there's very few alternatives to that particular chain of hardware and other products, retailing. And in that environment, of course, companies are in a much stronger position to pass on most of the costs by way of markups and just carry on. It really does depend on industry structure, product category, and alternatives as well. So, the precise inflationary effects are quite variable. Certainly, it's too simplistic to say, well, tariffs are inflationary. There's a lot that goes into the mechanisms by which tariffs ultimately feed back into the economic system.
Yeah. Which, in this example, and this is a simple example, and I think hopefully the audience from different countries sort of get this. In considering that, for example, a company such as Bunnings or its secondary suppliers says, no, we're going to make the customers pay more for that item. If that becomes like a real issue, then people are going to start to say to the government, this needs to be sorted out, because I can't build a house when things cost 3 times more, twice as much. And then the government may get involved, and then we start to have indications of nationalisation. So the companies don't want that either. So it is quite a complex situation. But look, Warwick, I wanted to pose this to you too, just as we have a few minutes, again, to contextualise so people get an idea of where you're coming from as an expert. We have an issue here in Australia because the professor and I are from Australia. We're in Australia. And I wanted to ask you this, and, from your view as a professor, as a professional and academic, we have this issue with central banks. Now, we know that central banks are totally unaccountable to the government. So what goes on in the meetings between a national central bank and the Bank for International Settlements is undisclosed completely. So no Senate inquiries, they're not disclosed. Is that something where we want to have something like the central banks participating in the BRICS Clear project, or we want central banks who are completely unaccountable to governments dealing with these sorts of really important transitions that we've been discussing tonight?
Well, they are participating in them because the governments of the countries in BRICS have decided that that's how they want to do it. That's what's happened. And,
yes.
and as part of the BRICS financial architecture, you'll also find that the new development bank is going to play an increasing role as well. So, these institutions fulfill roles in systems, and the role of the central bank is to act as the clearinghouse, if you will, for the transactions between commercial banks and other financial institutions within a national territory, and also interact with their counterparts in other countries, so that settlements across borders can take place as well. They're important vectors for the management of financial flows that may, for example, go to questions of capital controls, but they also are issues to do with money laundering and funding various forms of nefarious activities. Now, just about all countries around the world have signed up to a common set of objectives concerning anti-money laundering and counter-terrorism funding, and those need to be administered ultimately through the central bank. So central banks play important roles in the implementation of a broad range of government policy commitments.
So, in your opinion, in your professional opinion, Warwick, again, to give context of your view, do you support the idea of having private central banks, or do you think having a national bank where the government is actually in control of it? Because, the argument has been, and I don't want to get into this too much, but I'm just basically trying, you know, again, getting the context because we're talking about this. Do you think, in your opinion, is central banks better, private central banks better than government-owned national banks that are accountable to the?
Well, my question is better in terms of what?
Oh, generally, as I was mentioning before, the central banks are not transparent or actually accountable. They're independent. That is the nature. So I'm wondering what you think, as an expert.
Well, I'm trying to figure out what these words mean, I guess, Clive. Not accountable, do you mean by that central banks don't do what legislatures want them to do, for example, or executives want them to do? Is that what you mean by accountable? Yeah, yes. Look, I mean, over the last 30, 40 years, there is a history, particularly in Western countries, where an ideological view about central bank independence has emerged and became dominant. And prior to that, as in the case of Australia many years ago, but you know, it continues to be the case in other countries, of course, that governments and central banks actually are intimately intertwined. But governments and central banks actually do coordinate in all sorts of ways. But there is, to some extent, an ideological view that emerged over the last 40 years about this notion of central bank independence. I suspect that there is a little bit of pushback against that these days to varying degrees. So how much pushback there is on this question of central bank independence does vary from country to country. And I mean, we hear a little bit of noise in Australia from time to time around the issue. And there's obviously a pretty hot debate starting to bubble up in the United States in relation to the Fed. But in most BRICS countries, you won't find any of that stuff. You know, there's no anxieties at all around the role of the Russian central bank, the People's Bank of China, or the other central banks in the BRICS countries.
Okay. No, I wanted to get your view as a professional, but that's fine. I get it, because it is and I've put this question to you because this is a very fundamental, principled situation, right? And especially in the context of, you know, this boiling up, right, about tariffs, BRICS rising, US trying to keep its dominance. We have this currency. So anyway, that was just, you know, just to sort of end off a little bit. I really appreciate it.
And this is probably to dispel another little myth. People think central banks create the money. They generally don't, in the sense that most money is created by commercial banks when they create credit. That's the first thing to bear in mind. So in most modern economies, most of the new monies that come into an economic system is created by commercial banks issuing credit. Insofar as central banks are directly involved in the money creation process, that happens because legislatures actually call forth the money. So when appropriations bills are passed through parliaments or congresses, that legal authority causes the account of the government's special account with the central bank to be credited. The central bank doesn't create money other than as a function of appropriations decisions made by legislatures. So, you know, that's probably, you know, an important piece of the financial piping that people probably need to get their head around, because people often make comments like, you know, central banks print money, etc., etc.
Yeah, which is not accurate. Mm.
Well, it's not only that they don't print money in a physical sense, by and large, but it's actually, you've got to understand what the mechanisms are that actually have this happen. And the principal mechanism, insofar as central banks and their relationship with governments are concerned, is through some kind of a legally sanctioned appropriation process. And that's how it works.
Okay, no, excellent. Thank you very much, Adjunct Professor Powell. Thank you very much. Really appreciate you taking the time on short notice.
No problems at all.
Yeah, awesome. And we'll look forward to your third part in the series of articles. So, and I encourage the audience again, please go to Warwick Powell's Substack and have a look at his first article and the second article we were going through today. And as you said, probably in the next few days, you're going to do the next article?
Next few weeks.
Okay. No pressure.
We'll see. I've got a few other things that I'm working on at the moment, and look, I've actually finished the draft of this piece, but I'll just put it to one side for a little while and let it percolate for a couple of weeks maybe.
Get some feedback. Yeah.
Get a bit of feedback from some colleagues and before bringing it to the light of day.
Great. Okay. Thank you very much, Warwick.
Absolute pleasure again.
All right. Thank you for watching this episode of BRICS Briefs. Please like the show. If you didn't like the show, say you didn't like the show, share it and say you didn't like it, or share it and say you liked it and tell us why you liked it. Please subscribe to the channel if you'd like to see more of Warwick and all of our other professional guests and some of our more casual guests. Thank you for watching. Bye for now.